Well, hello and welcome everybody. This is State Senator Tim Ashe. I'm the president of the Vermont Senate, and I want to thank you guys for joining in for a discussion tonight about the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which I think is a very promising way for us to fight climate change and have Vermont play a lead role in doing that. I'm joined tonight by Dave Farnsworth of RAP, and that's a rather bureaucratic sounding organization called the Regulatory Assistance Project, but they're actually some of the leading thinkers, not just in Vermont, but in this country, and have worked around the globe helping address emissions challenges and better harnessing energy sectors, whether it's in states or even in regions of places like China. So Dave is a great resource, and we'll be able to talk at some length about how this whole program would work and how it compares to something Vermont already participates in called the Reggie program, but I'll save that for a bit. I want to thank Joey Miller at VNRC. I know she plays a instrumental role coordinating VECAN. Ian Hitchcock, also at VNRC, has helped make all this technology work, and I'm really appreciative that they've brought everybody together for the next hour of the discussion. I want to thank the town energy committees before I go on. I've worked with a number of them throughout the state, and I know that it's often thankless, but it's such critical work to support all the policies that municipalities and state government do. And so at this point, we're going to dive right in, and I'm going to, just so that people aren't distracted as we go through some of the screens, I'm going to take Dave and I off the video, but wanted to make sure you put our faces with our voices. And what we'll do is we'll do a little table setting about why TCI, this transportation initiative, is so important, and then talk about the process that it's going through and then how it'll work. Definitely encourage you to ask questions, submit them through the webinar system as we go, and if there's a question that's particularly relevant as we go, we'll stop and try to address it if it's helpful in providing clarity. So with that, I'm going to cut out the video and we will start moving right along. So to put things in the first context, I think it's important to know how Vermont has been doing in the three major sectors. Transportation, thermal, and electric emissions are not equal contributors to Vermont's contributions of harmful emissions towards climate change. This actually was taken from a slide in the Energy Action Network's 2018 report on how we're doing compared to our energy and climate goals. And what this story really tells is that around electricity, we've actually got relatively low emissions. That's the result of a lot of really great work at the local level and at the state level, many of our partners in the renewable energy sector. But transportation and heating, aka thermal, really remain places that we have so much more work to do, and transportation being the biggest, really the biggest one out of that. In some ways, before I turn to the next slide, this makes sense because we can control electricity in a way that's a little bit easier than these other sectors, because in Vermont we have regulated monopolies for different service areas like GMP or Vermont Electric Co-op or Burlington Electric where I live. And so working with them, we can basically tell them what we expect. We can require of it through our regulatory process. And these other sectors are much different and therefore have proven a bit harder to tackle. So one thing as we dive in, there are often comparisons state to state of how our emissions have been changing from the early 90s to 2017. And Vermont, we know from the report that was released last year, has seen its total greenhouse gas emissions go up, which is very discouraging. The next three slides compare Vermont to two of our neighbors, New York and Massachusetts. And what these reflect, and these came from this really nifty New York Times story, the in-state electric power generation. And so it doesn't tell the whole story of everything going on. For instance, it doesn't include the power we're purchasing that comes from out of state, which is likely to have higher emissions than what you see on this chart. But if you start with the Vermont picture, we had a relatively low greenhouse gas emissions from power generated in Vermont really for the last several decades. And therefore, while we still have challenges, we haven't had the opportunity to make significant reductions as a result of switching over from dirty power generation to cleaner power. Contrast that to Massachusetts in this slide, and you'll see that they have really achieved some serious reductions by getting rid of coal and petroleum, though they have shifted increasingly to another fossil fuel, natural gas, for the power generators that they have there. New York State, a pretty similar picture, increased reliance on natural gas, although they've seen their coal and petroleum plants going down almost to an insignificant level. So these aren't meant to tell the whole story, as I say, but I feel like they do give us some sense about one of Vermont's challenges on the greenhouse gas emissions front, is that our electric generating sector wasn't a particularly bad actor, unlike some of these other states. So turning to transportation, the point of this call, one of the reasons why it's so important that Vermont step up our efforts to reduce harmful transportation emissions is that, just like almost every other state, this is where we have been failing to make progress. This appeared about 2 weeks ago in the New York Times. They took the 100 top metro areas in America. Needless to say, Vermont did not feature in that list of 100. And what you see on the screen are the transportation-related emissions since 1990. And as you can see, Boston up 24%, Albany up 17%, and the Vermont figure of up 28% is using slightly different data source, but the point is really the same. These are areas where we've actually lost considerable ground, although we are in a similar predicament as many of our neighbor states. Now this is the last on this sort of background piece, but I sometimes am accused of not having much of a life, and so I'm either watching C-SPAN or poring over Department of Motor Vehicle databases. And having done so, I thought I would show you what I found when I poured through the data. The tweet that I put out on the left shows the top 10 types of vehicles registered in Vermont. And just to put it in a finer note here, so the 10th most prevalent vehicle, a Toyota Corolla, what that means is all the years of Toyota Corollas, which might currently be registered on the road. So it's not just a 2018, it's all the Toyota Corollas on the road. And as you can see, numbers 1 through 4 are all trucks, which of course have much lower mile per gallon performance. What this does not show is that the Ford F-Series, in which I included F-150, 250s, and 350s, there are 26,500 of them on the road in Vermont. If we go to the first non-truck, a Subaru Forester, there's only 16,500. So we have a considerable number of relatively poor performers in terms of mile per gallons on the road. And that's just a reality we have to face as we think about how we're going to proceed from here. Many of those trucks are being used for people who use them for work purposes. And so we have to be thoughtful and really contemplate how the manufacturers are producing the kind of vehicles that are necessary to do a lot of the work that has been typical to Vermont. The second tweet there just shows the total number of cars registered and the total number of trucks registered to give a little bit of extra context. Last year, we really considered and acted on a number of fronts to address transportation emissions. I won't go through all these because between this and the next slide, there are about 11 different interventions we made. And none of these are to say the job is done. In fact, it's the opposite. It's to say that despite these kinds of investments, and some of these are things we've done historically, we have still lost ground. And there are probably a lot of reasons we could have a long conversation about that. But some of these are very promising. The first one I'll just say, because the most fuel efficient vehicle from and the most effective for fighting climate change is the vehicle you don't actually use. So adding 33% capacity statewide to our park and ride system is actually really promising. rail transit, making one of the final investments to get rail from New York City to Burlington, very important. And then as we switch, all the incentives that are being deployed, both to help people get into new electric vehicles, but also in the case of lower income people, programs to help them get into far more efficient vehicles, working with community action agencies and others. But whether it's charging stations, electrifying the state's vehicle fleet, the ones that our state government uses, incentives for Vermonters of all income levels to get into vehicles, we made a number of strides, but I don't think any one thing has the potential to be as powerful as TCI. So at this point, let's turn to that, and I will just once again emphasize, if you have any questions as we go, feel free to submit them, and we will do our best to take them up if it would be helpful to stop as we go. So TCI is, it's called the Transportation and Climate Initiative. It's a mouthful, so we shorthand it to TCI. And it's what's called a cap and invest program. Frequently people hear the term cap and trade. This is called the cap and invest program, and we'll speak some about that. Dave will primarily do the focus. So TCI really began a number of years ago, but started to heat up in December of 2018, when the jurisdictions that have been looking at banding together to fight the emissions that come from the transportation sector issued a statement basically of intent saying we are going to work very closely together and figure out if we can go in together to have a huge impact on transportation emissions. Almost all the New England states were signatories to that initial statement. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Virginia, Washington, D.C. were also part of that statement. Just a few weeks ago, Peter Walk, who works for the Agency of Natural Resources, who is basically the point person for state government in this discussion with the other states and with Washington, D.C., announced that the coalition of states had released a framework for a regional proposal. And we're going to talk a little bit about what some of the elements are for that framework in a second. Right now, we're in a bit of a fact-finding mode. What they're calling the public input process includes municipalities, state governments, large and small businesses, organizations that work with low-income people and the elderly are all submitting information intended to help inform the framework that ultimately will be put forward before the states to decide if they want to participate. What we anticipate is that in December, there will be a near final policy proposal which will lay out a series of very detailed assumptions to signal not only to the members of the kind of the coordinating team who are trying to map this deal out, but also to people like those participating in this webinar to see what it is that we will get if we enter into this TCI program. So in the draft policy, which was released just, I think, first week of October, these are some of the themes that they're still trying to fine tune, but to give you a sense of the work ahead for Vermont and all the other states. And I'll just briefly touch on each of these. The equity issue is really trying to respect that there are rural states, there are more urban states, and then there are urban and suburban and rural areas within most of the states, and trying to make sure that the proceeds of the TCI program don't disproportionately accrue to those who have maybe the easiest ability to raise funds in the first place, and to make sure that those, especially the rural communities and areas with high concentration of elderly people, receive the kind of investments that are necessary so that they're not left behind. In terms of the fuels, currently gasoline and on-road diesel are the two fuels that have been agreed to. They're still in discussions about whether biofuels would be included in this global cap on emissions. The regulated entities, these are the actual people who would be subject to the limits that would be placed on the amount of carbon emissions from the transportation sector. And these are the types of firms that might own the big tanks at a port, or they might be the people who ship it into Vermont on tanker trucks. Then there are a series of, they're more than bureaucratic because they're really critical for people to have confidence that the program is delivering the required emissions reductions, but coming up with protocols around the reporting, around the monitoring and verification, all are really critical so that we don't just have the goal, but not a good sense that we're really driving towards meeting them. Flexibility and cost containment. This is trying to anticipate that every state has different types of investments that are necessary in order to achieve some of the smarter transportation strategies that are critical to meeting some of these emissions reductions targets. So trying to figure out how you would deal with a non-linear process while still getting the overall emissions reductions that we would like. And then the process of the auction and allocation. So as Dave's going to speak about in a second, it is not a simple process to determine who of those firms, the people who own the tanks that hold all the stuff at ports, the people who ship the fuel into the state, who gets to deliver the fuels into the partner states is its own important political question. On this slide, what you see is some of the additional policy questions around allowances for each state. So to put it simply, New York and Vermont are in quite different leagues when it comes to the amount of total emissions that are being produced. And as a result, that probably means that the proceeds will not be equal between states like New York and Vermont, but will follow some kind of formula that reflects the amount of emissions that the states are starting from, and that will affect how much money is returned to each state to target some of these challenges. Monitoring the market, this is because these are private companies who are the suppliers of fuel, making sure that we have integrity in that system. And then figuring out the process by which states can choose to use the funds, either in a direct way on things like public transit, or what they call complementary policies. And you can see a few examples below: a green bank, land use planning, and others. For those, hold on one sec. So at this point, we've kind of come up to where we're at. The draft policy items that we just reviewed are things that are being discussed right now in a public input process. So what we'll look at now just briefly is the what's next before we turn to Dave. So what we expect in January is additional public input after the December release of the draft MOU. This is going to be a critical time for town energy committees to step up and see if they have additional suggestions. In the spring of 2020, this is when the final MOU will be released. This is what I would call the moment of truth. This is the time where states and Washington, D.C. will decide whether they believe their jurisdiction should sign on to this program. There is some discussion about whether the governor can do this on his own or whether the legislature has to sign off. It is my belief the legislature should be at the table making this decision. I'll be introducing legislation with others to get the ball rolling on that. Assuming Vermont joins TCI in the period after that sign-up date, if you will, the jurisdictions who have signed on will be developing model rules and determining what additional state actions would be required. In Vermont, there would need to be possible rulemaking done at our public service department, our agency of transportation, our agency of natural resources. So there'll be a series of technical processes to effectuate the goals that we've said that we would like to see. And then as early as 2022, the program would be up and running. So at this point, I'm going to turn over to Dave. And I just remind those who joined in a touch late, Dave works for RAP, the Regulatory Assistance Project, which is based in Montpelier but works all over the world. Dave is one of the leading experts on a program called Reggie, which is a similar model that Vermont is a participant in on electric generation. So here I'm going to hand it over to Dave to really describe in a little bit more with a visual context how this thing will work.
Thank you, Senator Ashe. Appreciate that. It's great to be here, everybody. So we can jump to the next slide, which I think is going to take 5 hits. The reason we're talking about the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative on a webinar that's supposed to focus on the Transportation and Climate Initiative is that the proposal for TCI is to adopt a similar mechanism, their central mechanism, which is called Cap and Invest. Senator Ashe referred to it earlier on. What I'm going to do is talk about cap and trade and how that variation on cap and trade, Cap and Invest, has been adopted and the reasons for doing that. And before I jump in, I just want to note I got a question which I love this. It's great. I don't know who the questioner was, but it went straight to the jugular vein of this whole discussion. And so let's raise the question here and see whether or not we answer it by the time I get through the next 6 or 8 slides. It says pricing carbon at $5 a ton doesn't move the needle. $75 to $100 a ton does. Reggie doesn't do much at all. Why will TCI be successful? So let's talk about all this in the context of that question. And I hopefully will answer your question by the end of this part of the presentation. So what we're talking about is establishing a market-based regulatory framework. It's about establishing a market, obviously. And the reason that the Reggie states have decided to go ahead with transportation and to adopt this market, this approach is there are a number of reasons for it. One is quite simply their relationships. Folks have worked together, they trust each other, and they've been working at this for a long time. When I was at the Utility Commission in 2003, we started planning Reggie, and we spent 6 years planning it, modeling, before the program started up in 2009. So these relationships, this comfort with the approach, some of the infrastructure that TCI will use will be adopted from Reggie. The allowance tracking system, for instance. And the idea of establishing a market, the broader the market that you have, the greater likelihood that you're going to be able to change the way people do things, the way they buy and pay for transportation. Little Vermont would have a tough time doing it, but if you include the states from Virginia all the way up to Maine, there's a greater likelihood. And of course, if this were adopted nationwide, then you'd have an even better shot at it. Next slide, please.
Hold on, sorry about that.
So let's talk about Cap and Invest and how it works. So just the basic rundown here. We've got as a circular diagram, and let's start over at 9 o'clock on this clock face, so to speak. What sources are you going to include? The Senator alluded to this. We're talking about essentially wholesalers. We're not talking about all the gas stations. That would sort of be the middle of things. Or we're not talking about all the folks who buy gasoline. What we'd be talking about is hundreds of gas stations or tens of thousands of automobile owners. We're going to go up the stream to focus on a few who are at the head of this market. So fuel dealers and wholesalers. What we're going to do is adopt emissions factors that have been out there and been used already. The state of California has developed them. EPA has developed them. So at 12 o'clock here, you decide the sources, 12 o'clock, what emissions levels are going to start. And then what you do is put together everybody's emissions over a certain period. I think what TCI is going to do is choose an average of 3 years. And you'll develop a starting point, and then you'll develop a trajectory. They plan to go from 2022 to 2032 and to reduce a percentage, even percentage each year. So to have a reduction pathway, and there are other mechanics and other pieces, bells and whistles, according to this diagram, that will allow the states to run with this program. But that's essentially how you do it. You bring all the sources together, you decide to what degree they're emitting, and you put that together and develop a pathway for starting and then for reducing those emissions. Next slide, please. The first steps here, basically inventory. What are the CO2 emission sources? In Reggie, it was factories, not factories, excuse me, it was electric generating stations. Here, as we've mentioned several times, it's going to be wholesalers of fuel. And so what degree are they emitting? Like I said, California standards and EPA standards are out there, and you can determine how many tons or how many pounds of CO2 per gallon of diesel, per gallon of gasoline. And when you come up with that number of emissions, tons of emissions, then you develop a corresponding emissions budget, which is essentially the collection of allowances. Next slide, please. You'll see in these discussions oftentimes the word cap and budget used interchangeably. It's confusing, but you really shouldn't be that confused with it. One is tons, the cap is tons of emissions, and the budget is allowances. And of course, the allowances reflect the emissions. Each allowance will be worth a ton. And then you distribute them. Next slide. Distribution is a good word. Allocation is a word that's often used. Some emitters just say we would like an allocation as opposed to saying we want these given to us for free. Reggie states went through a long process where they thought it would be a cheaper program to administer if they gave away allowances. Then they realized that it would cost the same amount if they gave away allowances by comparison to selling the allowances. The way they sell them is through an auction. And so when you look at the ways that they can be distributed, they can be given away, they can be sold, in this case through an auction. They're also what are called set-asides. Basically, states can say, we want, for example, 15% of these allowances to go toward weatherization, or we want 15% of these allowances to go towards rural transportation hubs, something like that. So they're set aside. That's basically how the allowances will be distributed. And it's important to remember that allowances are money, and it's really important to keep track. So keep in mind those bags of money as we continue talking here and reflecting on the question we were asked earlier on. So what you've got here essentially is, besides my phone ringing, excuse me, what you've got here is sort of half of cap and invest. What I've just described here is the cap part. What I've described here is the putting a price on the thing you want to stop emitting part of this. If you have to buy an allowance for what you're used to doing, you're going to make it more expensive. You're going to start looking for alternatives. And this goes to the heart of that question. If you really want to change people's behavior, why are you putting $5 a ton out there? Why don't you make it $50 a ton? Well, part of the answer lies in the program just having a circuit breaker, a political circuit breaker, because people won't want to pay that much. The idea is to start at a low price, but that's just part of the picture. So what I've described here is cap and invest. I've described the cap part and putting the price on emissions part. Let me just talk quickly about compliance, and then I'll talk about the invest part of cap and invest. Next slide, please. So if you're an emitter here, if you're a wholesaler, how do you comply? How does this program work for you? So as this slide will show you, there are a bunch of fuel suppliers here. They've got their fuel tanks there with CO2 emissions for each of them and allowances for each of them. So essentially the way it works is emissions are measured, they're monitored. If you emit, for example, 10,000 tons a year, you'll need 10,000 allowances to cover those emissions. And you're probably gonna have to buy those allowances. There's a tracking system. It keeps track of all your sales, gallons of X type of fuel. And there's a tracking system that keeps track of the allowances that you've purchased and that you will have to surrender to comply with the program. Next slide, please. So what I've explained here is basically the cap part of cap and trade, right? Some folks pollute more, some folks pollute less. And if, as this diagram shows, you're looking at a factory, but it could be a fuel dealer. If you have leftover allowances, you can sell those, or you can keep them for the next compliance period. If you emit more than you've acquired, you're gonna have to spend some more money and get more allowances. You pay to pollute. But here's the question, what makes it cap and invest? Next slide. The point of cap and invest is revenue recycling. I asked you to keep an eye on those bags of money. What do the states do when they have an allowance and make all that money? Well, what works in the Reggie states is that in proportion to the emissions that are produced, Senator Ashe used New York and Vermont. One state's got lots of emissions, one state has less, but they sell allowances in an auction and they bring that revenue home in proportion to the emissions that they produce. And revenue recycling is simply taking that money and investing it in the sorts of things that will produce further emissions reductions associated with the program. So in the case of Reggie, there have been, I believe, there may be 4 3-year compliance periods with, as our questioner pointed out, low prices on carbon. They started out at $2, now they're around $6, $7 perhaps. So the question is, how are you changing behavior when you're putting a $2 price on carbon? Well, what you're doing is using the revenue. Well, how much revenue? In the first 3-year compliance periods, the Reggie states in total raised over $1 billion in revenue with a small price on carbon. And what they do is take that money back to their own states, and they, through modeling, figured that the lowest cost way to get rid of a ton and the most effective way to do that would be to invest in energy efficiency programs. And so what they did, and what they've done for nearly 10 years now, is make those investments. And so that's the invest side of cap and invest. So you've heard about regulation being a stick and a carrot. Well, the revenue recycling is the carrot part of this. So I don't want to minimize the price effect, which is the stick. Okay, that's important. You do get some sort of response, and the questioner suggested that doesn't do anything. That's incorrect. Actually, you do get people to change their behavior when you put a small price on something and they have alternatives. In this case, it'll be fuel wholesalers. They'll have to buy allowances, as I mentioned, and that'll be a cost. But next slide, please. So it's not so much from the price on carbon, but it's from investing those proceeds. And of course, you get a carrot by doing that and turning around and spending the money on the sorts of reductions and programs that states can have figured out will get them the reductions they need. Now, I mentioned that for the Reggie program, that was energy efficiency. The TCI program has to figure out what those investments actually are going to be. As the senator mentioned, it's one thing if you have a big urban area, your solutions are going to probably be really different than a state like Vermont or New Hampshire, Maine. that has a lot of rural area and dispersed population. But Reggie's Experience has been a low price per ton. Works really well if you turn around and take the money you raise and invest it intelligently. The question here is, can TCI develop that approach, that investment approach that will allow for a politically acceptable moderate price on transportation fuels, but an intelligent investment program that gets at creating the transition we want. We want to change the market from a market that's based on fossil fuels and single car transportation to a system that's cleaner and going to be better for us in the 21st century. So I will end there, and I hope I answered your question.
All right, and so as I said, I'm going to make Dave and I reappear here so that as we field some questions, you see the humans on the other side of it. So there we are. One question we have related to something that I had referenced earlier about potential legislation. So the question of whether the governor alone decides whether Vermont should become a signatory to TCI is one that hasn't been fully explored between the legislature and the executive branch. I think if the governor wishes to proceed, I think that it makes sense that he do it in collaboration with the legislature. But unquestionably, a number of elements of TCI would require legislation. And so I've had legislation drafted. It has not been introduced yet because we're out of session. And I'll be sharing that with, I think, every member of the Senate to see who would like to sign on. I would briefly say that the governor publicly has said that he is not committed to TCI, although he has some fantastic staff who are working very diligently on getting the best environmental deal possible. But in the meantime, he's cautioned whether people should say we should sign up for TCI. My belief is that we have to have the tools available to pass legislation. And so when we introduce it, we know that there are some details to be worked out. But the power, from my point of view, in TCI is that it bands together with some of the largest states in America from an economic point of view, which means that Vermont's impact, which is important, would be complemented by areas that have substantial greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. And so by collaborating, I feel like amplify the potential benefit. So stay tuned for that legislation. We'll make sure that Joey and her crew at VNRC share that when it's available. We have another question. This one I think I'll direct to you, Dave. And the question says, the cap and allocation of allowances is clear, and we will reduce emissions that way, but who gets the invest part? Technology reductions only, or are those things like carbon sequestration through forestry and agriculture? Will those be the kinds of things that might be eligible for some of the investing side?
It's a great question. The answer is there have been lots of ideas, and people have put those ideas out there, and nobody has made that decision yet. And that's why, especially why Peter Walk wants people's comments as to what approaches are going to be the strongest approaches. I think when you stand back and you think about the analysis that needs to happen, it's helpful to look at the Reggie example first. In the utility case, there's something called least cost planning, and that is how do you provide energy for the people who need the energy in the least cost manner? Can you do it through supplying them with more of something? Can you do that with helping them be more efficient? In other words, not having to supply them with everything, but making them more efficient in some ways. I think that's part of the question here, and it has to become part of the analysis. What's the cheapest ton is sort of the bumper sticker here. What's the cheapest TCI ton going to be? What's going to be, so that gets you at your carbon answer once you get there. And then there are overlays, there are political overlays. There are, what's the cheapest ton given that historically rural people have not had the access that folks living in the city have had to the transportation, the public transportation. What's the cheapest ton if you add an overlay that looks at seniors and the needs that they have, as opposed to the simpler answers which might be in the city? So that's part of the analysis. Go for the cheapest ton and then add the other challenges that you face.
Yeah, and I think one of the earlier slides in the presentation talked about complementary investments, and I think that's thinking about things like carbon sequestration through agriculture and forestry would certainly fall into that category. I did receive an email in advance of this webinar from a town energy committee member who couldn't participate tonight, asking what the role of town energy committees might be, which I thought was a very important question, because it gets to the heart of some of this, which is local community members will have a better sense than a group of people from other states sitting at a negotiating table what might benefit Vermont communities. And so all of the town energy committee who are represented in this call, one of the things that's really important in the upcoming couple months is to determine what you believe would be the kinds of investments which would really help reduce the transportation related emissions in your community. From a legislative point of view, I'll confess, sometimes it's really challenging, because I'll hear someone say, with all the right goals and intentions, you need to double public transit. Well, doubling public transit in terms of dollars is something we could do in the budget. The real question then is, but what do you do with it? Because the solution for Burlington, where I live, is going to be possibly different than it is in many of the more rural communities around Vermont. So that's an opportunity that's right in front of all of you who are participating tonight to share your best thinking. I have another question, which is, I'm going to summarize it, which is basically that TCI is very complex, which is I believe a true statement, although we have some precedent working on it. And a gas tax could be adopted very quickly by Vermont. We wouldn't need to seek anybody else's permission, and that would have an immediate effect if it was paired with some kind of rebate program for low-income people. Why not choose that option instead of TCI, which could take a long time to get going? And I think I'll take this one because it really is it's a political question more than a technical question. Because frankly, we could do both, as though there's nothing precluding doing all the strategies that people have as ideas. But the power of all of these states across on the eastern seaboard banding together, to me, is what makes TCI so very attractive, because then we're looking not just at Vermont's strong efforts to reduce transportation emissions, but we're helping ensure that we see the same thing in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, and so on. And we need those states to step up because of the amount of emissions. To the heart of the question, though, is what if it all seems like it's taking too long? The states can't agree. We come to March of 2020 and there's no agreement despite their best efforts. What then? And I think at that point, we step back and say, well, TCI, we can't, the planet's not going to wait for you to get negotiated. But I think that's the moment to really have that question about if alternates need to be developed. One other piece I'll just quickly say, and I think Dave knows this through the Reggie program, is that it's not to say that we do TCI if that's where things land, and that's all we do to try to improve our performance on transportation. We have a whole array of things we need to get right with fast. Our public transit organizations are actually struggling because of low ridership, and one of the things the legislature is trying to do is figure out how we boost ridership on public transit, not only for their financial health, but for the environmental improvements that will represent. The park and ride model, which I've described, is something that we're expanding greatly this year and next. We need more people to be using alternate ways to get to and from work. And right now we have let's just say we have a long way to go. The state's vehicle fleet, the transition to electric through state policies is attractive because it's something we can control, but it's also wouldn't come cheap. So we have 3,000 registered electric vehicles in Vermont right now. For those of you who have read the Energy Action Network's summary of all the strategies that would have to be compiled to meet our goals, they believe we'd have to have about 90,000 electric vehicles within about 5 years. So we're going to see the industry move in some place. We're providing incentives, but that's another area where either some of the TCI proceeds could be invested, or we have to supplement with other aggressive strategies. Dave, I don't know if you have some thoughts from the Reggie experience about anything I've just said.
I agree with everything you've just said, and I think hammering on the point that you made about the larger region, TCI's 12 states and the District of Columbia, that's a much bigger lever. That changes behavior. Auto dealerships, auto manufacturers will pay attention to that. If Vermont went ahead by itself, I don't know that Detroit would change its strategy for producing automobiles. But if you have 12 northeastern states do that, that's a really serious point. The question was about a tax. I love it when people say a tax is much more simple than cap and trade. If you ever took a law school course and looked at the U.S. tax code, I don't think you'd be quite so quick to say that tax looks simple. But tax does tell you what the price is going to be. It doesn't tell me how many tons I'm going to get over with a tax, but it'll tell me what the price is. A cap tells you how many tons you'll get, but you don't know exactly what the price will be. But cap and invest does both things that a tax from a legislature and then earmarking investments and programs from a legislature gets you. It raises the money on the one hand, and then through a public process decides what that money is going to be invested in. So I think it actually is, it's sort of a microcosm, and it can work more quickly. And as one of the questioners pointed out, we need to get going.
Dave, another question on that point. We had someone ask if the suppliers have to buy allowances per the visual that you showed on an earlier slide, the question actually gets to the heart of it for the average person who maybe doesn't think as much about this. Will they pass along the expense to consumers by raising the price at the pump? Is that something that's knowable, something that our participation in Reggie helps inform?
It certainly does. It does. Yeah, you can count on them passing on the costs. I talked about the Reggie states first thinking that they could keep the program effects and the cost of the program down by freely allocating allowances. What happened was, I call it the Jed Clampett effect. Remember, Jed was out shooting for some food, up from the ground come bubbling crude. Next thing you know, Jed's a millionaire. How does he become a millionaire? Well, he got something for free, but the market gave him a price, and next thing you know, he's a millionaire. So if you give away allowances, anybody subject to this program is going to turn around and sell them anyway. Economists call that opportunity cost. So you're going to have that problem where you pass on down the line the costs. This motivated the Reggie states to try to figure out how they could hedge the exposure of ratepayers to a bump in electricity prices. First, it's important to remember the price per ton was not that big. So what was being passed on wasn't that big a bump. But what they decided was that if you use energy efficiency, what you would do is reduce the exposure to the price increase that ratepayers could expect to experience. So efficiency allows them to shrink their bill despite maybe rates going up a little bit. The TCI program is going to have to do the same thing. It's going to have to think about what happens to the folks who are directly affected by this. And I can see folks saying, well, everybody's going to be affected by this. I would agree with that. And actually some will be more extremely affected by this. Lower income folks will be more affected by this. But that's why you have to design the invest part of this in a way that you can actually make it neutral on some parts of the population, or you can design programs that get them out of the way sooner, make them, for instance, put them into an electric vehicle, for example, sooner, and hedge their exposure to the bump in the price that you reasonably should expect.
Dave, another question is, what if one of the states doesn't meet its target? On let's say it's a 3-year target and they miss it. Should we expect the way this would be designed to include some kind of penalty? If so, like, what does that look like, a penalty? And then what if the whole program doesn't meet its expectations and reduction targets? How did Reggie handle those things?
Okay, so what you're doing is describing a situation where some emitter actually isn't meeting its targets, or some group of emitters are not reaching their targets before it becomes an entire state's problem. In that case, using the Reggie analogy, because I don't know that these rules have been adopted for TCI, Reggie built upon the Clean Air Act, the Federal Clean Air Act, which envisioned emitters not from, a case where emitters wouldn't make their goals. They're not allowed to make any money. They're not allowed to avoid paying that way. They actually end up having to provide the allowances. They actually end up being charged 3 times the amount of allowances under the Clean Air Act and under Reggie. So you can't really slip around this. There's a 3-year compliance period in Reggie. It's very likely that TCI will adopt that and make sure over the first year and the second year that the compliance entities are acquiring allowances, so they're essentially, so to speak, able to get their homework in when it's due. And it's not going to be a mad rush at the 11th hour, the night before everything's due. So there are mechanisms in place. That's what Reggie decided to do. That's what TCI could do. In addition, states have regulatory authority to do any number of things to folks who don't pay their taxes or don't meet the requirements of environmental programs. And so in addition to what Reggie states might suggest, that individual states adopt, states have their own compliance solutions as well.
Another question, and just a reminder, we have about 5 minutes left, so if you have any last questions, make sure you submit them on the forum. The question of when we'll know what the capped amounts would be under the proposed agreement. Obviously, that's going to be something that many people on this call are going to be really looking to, is the pace of reductions that are set out. When would that be anticipated?
Unmute myself, excuse me. It's my understanding that the states are taking comments now, and they're going to develop a draft MOU by the end of the year. That draft MOU is going to have proposed cap levels and trajectory for the cap, price per ton. It's going to have all the big ticket items in there, and that's what the states are going to have to go back and think about and decide whether or not they're going to sign on for.
Okay, so that's something people are going to want to stay very attuned to, because that's some are going to certainly believe it goes too far. Some are going to believe doesn't go far enough. My guess is there aren't going to be many people who believe it got it just right. And then we'll be weighing some of these questions about whether by joining forces with so many states that whatever the capped amounts are, they're sufficient to really address a big chunk of the transportation emissions sector. We've got another question here. Let me see if I can sort of synthesize it. It says, I'll read it because I think maybe it will be easier, Dave, and direct it to you. As we electrify the transportation sector, the PUC and the Department of Public Service seem focused more on, hold on here, more on rate reduction than carbon reduction. How could we use TCI revenue to make sure we're able to reduce greenhouse gases from the transportation sector while we provide equity to ratepayers? So I guess the real question is, how do we marry the conventional rate concerns of the Public Utility Commission with the existential question of saving our planet? have those kinds of considerations been included in the work of the PUC and other sectors, and might that help us here?
It's a great question. To set it out really briefly, part of the answer lies in the fuel that electric vehicles are going to be using. Electric vehicles are 2 to 3 times more efficient in their fuel use than our internal combustion engine vehicles. That's part of the answer. The source of electricity generation is also part of the answer. The trend nationally has been very positive. Coal has been getting pushed aside by natural gas and renewables. If you want even cleaner electricity, there's going to be the question of how long natural gas stays on and how long it's going to take to push that away and, for instance, replace it with more renewables. The news is good there. Renewables are coming in at really, really low cost these days. Renewables tend to be variable, however. There's good news there because electric vehicles can be charged at different times of the day. They're flexible in their load, so they can be charged at times when renewables are operating and thereby make the power system itself more flexible. So there are some really good basic trends in technology that favor a cleaner outcome. The rate question about the department and the Public Utility Commission, because like you said, their job is, it's focused largely on the economics of these sorts of things, although they do have environmental duties that they have to meet as well, or that the legislature can give them even in a more prescriptive fashion if that's what they're inclined to do. One of the most interesting charging pilots around the country is what GMP offered over the last year or so, where they give you, if you're a new car EV buyer, they give you a level 2 charger that can be controlled via Wi-Fi, and they give you an off-peak rate if you agree to be controlled off of peaks with 24 hours notice. It's a really great model. They're coming up with a different model where I think they want to give folks a favorable rate. And I think the Department of Public Service is arguing that it's not favorable enough. So you're going to see probably a case that comes up in the next 6 or 8 months where the department's going to come in and say that per kilowatt hour charge for EVs should be lower because GMP, you can go out into the wholesale market and buy cheap electricity at night, and these things can charge at night, so why are you charging so much? That's to be determined. But the point here is, if given the technical background with respect to efficient vehicles, the good trends in the power markets and the generation out there, and good regulatory policy, there's a connection between lower cost, consumers saving money, and consumers avoiding dirtier power if they're controlled and charged in a smart way. Sorry to run on, but that's, I think, the answer.
No, it's an important context you provided. It's the Public Utility Commission, for those who don't appear before it, can be a mysterious acronym type bureaucracy. The work they do is complicated. The legislature has given it goals that it has to factor into some of its more technical work, and whether it's the future of our efficiency utilities, or as we electrify transportation, the PUC will be a key player in navigating those waters. We've hit the bewitching hour. We did have one more question, which I think I'll use as a way of wrapping up. And it's a question that showed some skepticism about whether TCI will work, in part because it's working with fuel wholesalers who are unregulated. And to that question, I can only say that if the states believe that they can sort of put a fence around those who are, maybe a stockade fence is probably more appropriate, around the fuel suppliers who would be subject to this, and if they have the confidence to do that, then I'd like to see that we try. So it is true that it is unlike Reggie, and that we're not dealing with regulated electric utilities. But then the question is, really, what if other states decide to pair other strategies, including carbon taxes, price on carbon, or other things like that. And I think I'll go back to an earlier point, which is that the Vermont legislature and the executive branch cannot just do TCI and cannot just be a continued participant in Reggie and some of the status quo. I think we all know that that's not the case, which is why we've been trying to ramp up our appropriations in a number of environmental strategies. Things like WCI, which is the Western Climate Initiative, which includes Quebec and California, we're exploring how Vermont could potentially partner up into that marketplace, which has some parallels to the discussion we've just had. But so looking at other strategies is an imperative. This is not a we do TCI and then we go like this and then it's over, we've saved the planet. We will not have saved the planet by just doing TCI. I think I'm going to wrap here because we had promised an hour. And what I hope people got out of this dialogue was kind of a high level what this TCI initiative is, how it can play a role in addressing our transportation emissions, which is our biggest problem in Vermont at the moment. We have a lot of promising things going on, a lot of goodwill to try to fight for good solutions. And I look forward to working with as many of you as possible in the days ahead. And I know that many other legislators feel exactly the same way. So I believe this presentation will be available to you if you'd like to see it. If there's any source information that you would like to ask about, just let me know. Some of the things I pulled from the New York Times, for instance, I can get that to you very easily. And I want to thank Dave, who's got a lot of expertise and a very clear way of speaking about what can be a very technical and complicated subject matter for those who aren't in the profession themselves. So Dave, thank you so much for helping us out tonight and get to the bottom of this TCI thing.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. And at this point, I think we're going to sign off. Thank you.